She was just a girl who poured whiskey for a living. No last name worth mentioning. No family left in the territory. Just rough hands, a stained apron, and the kind of tired that settles into your bones when you've been invisible your whole life. She worked the Golden Spur Saloon in a dusty Kansas border town in 1873, a place where the floorboards creaked, the lanterns smelled like burnt fat, and the men who came through the door brought trouble as naturally as they brought their boots. Nobody paid much attention to Clara Holt, and that was the point. You kept your head down, you filled the glasses, and you thanked God when the night ended without someone putting a hand on you. But on a Wednesday in late October, a Comanche warrior named Striking Bear walked through that saloon door, and everything Clara had learned about keeping quiet, staying small, and surviving by being invisible got turned completely upside down. What happened next wasn't written in any newspaper. No politician made a speech about it, no preacher held it up as a sermon. It passed through that town the way most true things do, quietly, mouth to mouth, one person at a time, until the story wore grooves into the memory of everyone who heard it. This is that story, and it begins with a girl being hurt for doing her job. It ends with a warrior doing something no one in that saloon had ever seen a man do before. And in between there's a moment so unexpected, so simple and so human that even now 150 years later it stops you cold. Pay attention, and because what Striking Bear did that day wasn't dramatic. Honestly, it wasn't violent. It wasn't the stuff of legend in the way that battles are legend. It was something much harder than that. It was the right thing done quietly, by someone who had every reason in the world to walk away and chose not to. That is the whole story, really. Plus, everything else is just the walk toward that moment. Clara Holt had been working at the Golden Spur for 2 years when she stopped flinching every time the front door opened. That took longer than it should have the first few months. Every new face sent a little jolt of fear down her spine, a leftover habit from the years before the saloon, years she didn't talk about and didn't revisit except in dreams she tried hard not to remember. But by the time the fall of 1873 came around, she had settled into something that looked, from the outside, like calm. It wasn't calm, exactly. It was more like exhaustion that had learned to sit still. The Golden Spur wasn't the worst saloon in Caldwell, Kansas. That distinction belonged, I think, to the Rattler, 2 streets over, where a man had been knifed over a card game just the previous spring, and the owner, a heavyset man named Dolph Briggs, had reportedly swept the blood off the floor before the body was even cold and reopened for business. The Golden Spur at least had curtains on the windows. The owner, a former Missouri riverboat hand named Gerald Cass, didn't encourage the worst behavior, not because he was a good man particularly, but because dead customers were bad for business and he wasn't teaching if not practical. Clara was one of 3 women who worked the floor. The other 2 were Mavis, who was 34 and had the permanent expression of someone who had been disappointed so many times that disappointment had simply become her natural face, and a younger woman named Ruth who had arrived from Ohio 6 months ago, still carrying the last of her optimism like a small lamp she kept cupped in her hands. Clara liked them both, and she didn't confide in either of them. She had learned some years back that confiding was a form of hope, and hope in this particular corner of the Kansas border country was a thing to be rationed very carefully. Her mornings started at 7. She swept the main floor, wiped down the bar, rinsed the glasses in a tin basin, and set out the stools that had been stacked against the far wall overnight. Gerald opened at 10, though business rarely picked up until afternoon. The real crowd came in the evenings, cowboys off the cattle drives, land agents from the east who wore suits that were clean for exactly 1 day before the dust of the territory got into every thread, buffalo hunters who smelled like what they did for a living, and the usual loose collection of drifters, gamblers, and men who didn't introduce themselves by name. The work wasn't complicated. She, I think, poured whiskey, which she brought beer. She carried plates of whatever the cook, an elderly man named Amos, had produced from the kitchen behind the bar, usually some combination of salt pork and beans and cornbread so dry it could have been used as building material. She smiled when smiling seemed to prevent trouble. She didn't smile in a way that invited the wrong kind of attention. She had calibrated this to a very fine degree. It was practically an art form by now. The men who came through the Golden Spur weren't, for the most part, violent. They were rough, many of them. They were loud. They said things to Clara and to Mavis and to Ruth that a person of any decency wouldn't say. Some of them grabbed. Gerald had a rule about that, the rule being that he would ask a man once to keep his hands to himself, and if the man didn't listen, he would be asked to leave. Whether this rule was enforced depended entirely on how much money the man in question was spending, which meant it was enforced inconsistently at best and not at all at worst. Clara had developed her own set of rules, internal ones, that she followed with more consistency than Gerald followed his. Keep the bar between yourself and the customer whenever possible. Never refill a glass for a man who is already looking at you a certain way. If a hand comes toward you, step back and say something cheerful and distracting before it lands. If it lands anyway, say nothing. Move to the other side of the room. File it in the category of things that happen and cannot be changed and must be survived. She was good at surviving, and it was perhaps the thing she was best at. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail, which meant it existed in a permanent state of transition. People arrived and departed with the rhythm of cattle drives and seasonal work. Families came through, in my opinion, on their way west and looked at the place with a kind of cautious hope that made Clara tired to witness. Nothing about Caldwell warranted that hope. It was a practical town, a place to sell things and buy things and rest before moving on. The permanence of it was an illusion maintained by the people who had decided, for whatever reason, to stay. The Comanche had been coming through the territory longer than anyone in the town had been alive. The treaties that were supposed to settle where they belonged, and where they didn't, had been made and broken, and remade so many times that the paper they were written on might as well have been used for something more practical. Clara knew very little about the Comanche basically. What she knew she had absorbed from the conversations in the saloon, which meant what she knew was mostly wrong and almost entirely shaped by fear. She knew they were skilled horsemen. She knew they had fought the Army and the Texas Rangers and a great many others across the southern plains. She knew their name carried a certain weight in the territory, a weight made up partly of genuine respect, partly of the kind of fear that gets dressed up as respect because fear alone sounds like weakness. She had never spoken to a Comanche man before October 22, 1873. She had seen them at a distance twice, once a group of riders moving along the horizon south of town, dark shapes against a pale sky, there and gone before she could look properly. Once, closer at the edge of the market street, two men on horseback who had come to trade and were conducting their business with an elderly merchant who kept his eyes very carefully on the goods being exchanged rather than on their faces. Clara had watched from the doorway of the saloon. Mavis had come to stand beside her and said in a flat voice, "Best come inside." Clara had gone inside because Mavis had been in this territory longer than she had and her flat voice was worth listening to. So when Striking Bear came through the door of the Golden Spur on that Wednesday afternoon, Clara's first reaction wasn't what she might have expected of herself. There was the jolt of fear, yes. It moved through her fast, the way cold water moves when you step into a creek without warning. But it settled almost immediately into something more like alertness, the same alertness she brought to any unfamiliar situation that could go wrong. He was taller than most of the men who came through the door. Not extraordinary, she had served cowboys who topped 6 feet by an inch or two. There was something about the way he carried his height that made it seem greater than it was. He moved without any of the self-conscious swagger she associated with young men who were trying to appear dangerous. He simply walked, the way a person walks when they're entirely comfortable with themselves and haven't anything to prove to the room they're entering. His clothing was a combination of things, a worn leather vest over a plain shirt. That might once actually have been trade goods, trousers that were practical and travel-stained, boots. He wasn't wearing paint. He wasn't carrying anything that looked immediately like a weapon, though Clara didn't look too carefully on that particular count. He stopped inside the door and took in the room. This wasn't unusual, most people coming in from the bright afternoon light paused to let their eyes adjust. But the way he did it was unhurried and deliberate, like a man reading a document carefully before he signs it. The saloon was about half full. Mid-afternoon, a Tuesday crowd, 3 cattle hands at the far table playing cards, 2 men at the bar drinking without conversation, a land agent named Fowler whom Clara recognized because he came in twice a week and always ordered the same thing and tipped badly. The conversation in the room didn't stop when the door opened. It slowed. The slowing moved through the room like a wave, table to table, without being dramatic about it. Striking Bear walked to the bar and he sat down on one of the stools, the one on the end, closest to the door, which Clara noticed and filed away without quite knowing why, and he put both hands flat on the bar surface. This was a gesture she associated with men who wanted to make it clear they weren't reaching for anything. She had seen it before, usually from men who had been in trouble with law enforcement and had learned to make their intentions visible. Gerald wasn't behind the bar. Gerald was in the back doing whatever Gerald did in the afternoons, which usually involved a bottle of his own whiskey and a complicated internal argument with himself about the state of his finances. Clara was behind the bar. It was her station for the afternoon shift. I guess she walked to him. She did this the way she walked to every customer, directly, without hesitation, because hesitation invited interpretation and interpretation invited trouble. She set her hands on the bar across from his. "What can I get you?" she said. He looked at her. His eyes were dark and very steady, and there was an assessment in them that wasn't hostile. It was simply the look of a person who was deciding something. She had seen men look at her many ways. This wasn't a look she had a category for. "Water," he said, "and whatever food is available." His English was clear. There was a formality to it, not the formality of someone performing politeness. The formality of someone who had learned the language from deliberate study rather than casual immersion, every word placed with care. "I can do that," Clara said. She turned and filled a glass from the water pitcher and set it in front of him. She went to the kitchen pass-through and told Amos, who was sitting on a stool reading a newspaper he had read at least 3 times already, that she needed a plate. Amos looked up, looked at the bar, looked back at the newspaper, and got up without comment. He was, of the people in the Golden Spur, the one whose reactions Clara trusted most. The 2 men at the bar had moved. Not dramatically, they hadn't jumped to their feet or made a scene. They had kind of simply, with the slow, deliberate motion of men who considered themselves casual, shifted their stools about 3 feet to the left. Clara saw this. She poured water into a second glass she didn't need and set it on the bar and didn't look at them. The card players at the far table were talking again, but it was the kind of talking that fills space rather than the kind that means anything. Fowler TBH, the land agent, was starring. He wasn't being subtle about it. Striking Bear drank the water and didn't look at any of them. Clara brought the plate salt, pork, beans, bread, and set it in front of him. He nodded. She went to refill the water pitcher at the pump behind the bar, and when she came back, Fowler had moved from his table to the bar, 3 stools down from Striking Bear, and was watching with the specific expression of a man who has decided that something is his business when it isn't. "You, to be fair, serve his kind now," Fowler said. Plus, he said it to Clara. He said it in the tone of someone lodging a reasonable complaint with a reasonable authority, which was perhaps the most offensive thing about it. Clara set the pitcher down. "I serve anyone who comes in and orders," she said. "Gerald know about this?" "Gerald knows I run the afternoon bar," Clara said. "Same as every day." Fowler made a sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite anything else either. He looked at Striking Bear, who hadn't looked up from his plate. "You know what your kind did up near Wichita last spring," Fowler said. He was speaking louder now, which he had decided apparently that this was a public conversation. Striking Bear picked up the bread and broke it in half. "Could have killed a dozen settlers," Fowler continued. "Women and children, you people got." "That's enough," Clara said. The room went a particular kind of quiet. It was the quiet that falls when something unexpected has been said by someone unexpected. Fowler turned to look at her. His expression had moved past surprise into something harder. "Excuse, I think me." "I said that's enough," Clara said. "He came in here same as you, he ordered same as you, he's eating same as you, that's all that's happening here." Fowler's face went red, not the red of embarrassment, the red of a man who has been contradicted by someone he considers beneath his contradicting. "You watch yourself," he said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that wasn't calm. "You're here to serve, girl, that's all, you don't get to tell me." He reached across the bar. He didn't grab her wrist, not exactly. His hand closed around her forearm just below the elbow, not hard enough to leave a mark but hard enough to make clear that he was making a point. Clara went very still, which she had to practice stillness for moments like this. A stillness that wasn't acceptance but was the thing you did when you were calculating what you could and couldn't do, and the calculation wasn't coming out in your favor. "You're here to serve," Fowler said again, "and that's it, nothing else." He let go, stepped back, straightened his coat. Clara didn't move. Her arm was still on the bar where he'd left it, and she was looking at the space just past Fowler's shoulder, and the practiced stillness had settled over her like a coat that was too heavy and fit too well. From 3 stools down there was a sound. Not a word, not a shout, just the sound of a wooden stool being pushed back across a floorboard and a man standing up. Bear set down his bread. He turned on his stool to face Fowler. He didn't stand fast, he didn't make any motion that could be described as threatening. He simply turned and stood the way a person stands when they've decided something and the deciding is done and now they're simply in the process of carrying it out. He looked at Fowler for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "You should sit down." The whole room went still. Fowler opened his mouth. Something moved across his face, a sequence of things actually, starting with outrage and moving through uncertainty and landing somewhere around a recalculation he hadn't expected to be making. He wasn't a coward exactly, and he was a man who had been in enough border country situations to read them reasonably well. And what he was reading right now was giving him information he didn't enjoy receiving. "This doesn't concern you," Fowler said, but his voice had changed. Some of the certainty had gone out of it. "She brought me food," Striking Bear said. "She brought me water. When you spoke to her that way, it became something that concerns me." A long pause. "Sit down," Striking Bear said again. Kind of the same quiet, the same complete absence of performance. Fowler sat down, and it wasn't the end of the story, not by a long stretch. There was still the matter of what happened after and what Fowler did when he left the saloon that evening and what was said in the streets of Caldwell in the days that followed, and the thing that happened 3 days later that would force Striking Bear to make a choice far more costly than the quiet command he had just delivered. But Clara, standing behind the bar with her arm still resting on the wood where Fowler had left it, would remember this moment for the rest of her life. Not because of what Striking Bear had done, or not only that, but because of the thing she felt in the moment after Fowler sat down. She had felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a person. Not a serving girl, which not a pair of hands attached to an apron. Not a piece of furniture in a room that men moved through without noticing. A person, which one who had just been defended, not with violence, not with grand declaration, but with 2 quiet words and the weight of a man who had decided that what had happened wasn't acceptable and that he was in a position to say so. She looked at Striking Bear. He had turned back to his plate. He picked up the other half of the bread. "Thank you," Clara said. He nodded. "TBH, which the food is good," he said. It wasn't what she had expected him to say. "I guess," she almost laughed. She TBH, pressed her lips together and turned to the water pitcher and refilled his glass, and her hands weren't quite steady, and she was grateful for that small, ordinary task. At the card table in the back, one of the cowboys had put his cards face down on the table and was looking at the door with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. The two men at the bar hadn't moved from their new position, 3 feet to the left. Amos had appeared at the pass-through, holding his newspaper, looking at the room with the expression of a man who has witnessed something worth witnessing. Fowler sat at the bar and didn't speak and didn't look at anyone. Outside, the afternoon sun was doing what it always did in October, burning low, orange through the saloon windows, making long rectangles of light across the floor that slowly shifted as the hours passed. Clara had watched this happen hundreds of times, the light coming in, the dust pretty much floating in it, the ordinary machinery of an afternoon continuing regardless of what people inside chose to do with themselves. She watched it now. She, I think, was thinking about the word defend, about what it meant to be defended, about how rarely it had happened in her life and how strange it felt, not like rescue exactly, because she hadn't been in danger of anything permanent, hadn't been drowning in any literal sense, more like being seen. Like actually, someone had walked into the room where she had been invisible for 2 years and said simply by their action, "I can see you. You are here. Plus, I think what happens to you matters." She didn't know anything about Striking Bear yet. She didn't know where he had come from or where he was going or what his life had contained that had made him the kind of man who turned on a stool and said sit down to a man who had hurt a woman he didn't know. She didn't, to be fair, know the history that was coming, the way this incident would ripple outward through the town, the way Fowler would carry his humiliation home and sharpen it against the whetstone of his resentment, the way things would get harder before they got better. She knew only this: a stranger had seen her and had spoken on her behalf and had returned to his meal as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, which she thought perhaps it should be. The light moved across the floor. Amos went back, to his newspaper. The card players picked up their hands. Clara refilled the water glasses and went back to work. By nightfall on Wednesday, most of Caldwell had heard a version of what happened at the Golden Spur, not the correct version. The correct version was quiet and specific and lived entirely in the details: the arm on the bar, the bread broken in half, the 2 words spoken without drama. The versions moving through the town by nightfall were something else. They had been filtered through the particular imagination of border country people for whom a Comanche warrior in a saloon was a story with predetermined shape, and the shape was almost always about threat, about violence, about the narrow escape from something terrible. The fact that nothing terrible had happened in any conventional sense didn't prevent these versions from suggesting otherwise. Fowler had told his story first. He had left the Golden Spur about an hour after his confrontation with Striking Bear, and he had gone directly to the hardware store, where the owner, a stout man named Percy Aldwin, ran an informal clearinghouse for local information. Fowler told for what it's worth Percy what had happened. Plus, Percy's expression during this telling was the expression of a man carefully separating what he was hearing from what he was being asked to conclude about what he was hearing. I liked the time Fowler finished. Percy had concluded several things, only one of which he shared aloud, which was, "Sounds like you put your hand on Clara Holt and a man asked you to stop." Fowler hadn't liked this interpretation. He had tried several framings before he left the hardware store, each one repositioning him as the reasonable party and Striking Bear as the danger. In each version, the incident became less about what he had done to Clara, more about the threat he had identified and bravely confronted for the good of the community. In the version he was telling by dinnertime, he had stood his ground until the situation calmed, rather than sitting down as directed by a man 3 stools away. Human memory is a flexible instrument. Fowler wasn't lying exactly, he was doing the thing people do when the truth of a situation reflects poorly on them, which is to rearrange it until the most uncomfortable parts face the wall. The town received his version with the selective credulity that border communities reserve for stories that confirm what they already believe. Most of the men who heard it nodded. Some of them expressed concern. A few of them said something should be done, which was the standard response to any situation whose shape seemed to call for action without anyone being willing to specify what action. The women who heard it, the few who were part of the information circuit, were quieter, and their quiet had more in it than the men's nodding. Mavis, who heard about it from Ruth, who had come in for the evening shift and spoken to Clara before Clara went off to her room above the haberdashery 2 streets over, said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Did he hurt her?" Ruth said. Fowler grabbed her arm. Mavis said, "I meant the Comanche man." Ruth said he hadn't touched her. Mavis nodded and went back to work. Amos, asked about it later by Gerald Cass, said, "Fowler put his hand on Clara. The man, for what it's worth, at the bar asked him to stop. Fowler stopped." Gerald said, "That's all." Amos said, "That was enough, wasn't it?" Gerald had mixed feelings about the whole thing, which was his default position on most things. On one hand, he didn't like the idea of trouble in his establishment. On the other hand, his establishment hadn't actually been troubled the afternoon had preceded. Without violence, without damage to property, without anything that required his involvement in any practical sense. On a third hand, which Gerald privately possessed though he never let it show, he was aware that Fowler had put his hand on Clara, and he was aware that this was something he should have done something about himself, and he was aware that he hadn't been present to do it, and he was aware that a stranger had done what he should have done. This third hand wasn't a comfortable one to examine. Gerald left it in his pocket. Clara, for her part, was in her room above the haberdashery, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, looking at her arm where Fowler's hand had been. There was no mark, there had been barely any pressure. It was the to be fair kind of contact that courts would never bother themselves with, that constables would shrug at, that left no evidence except the memory of it, which was, of course, the point. Men like Fowler had understood for a long time that the most effective kind of control is the kind that doesn't leave evidence. She wasn't, thinking about Fowler, though. She was thinking about Striking Bear. Plus, she was trying to understand something not about him specifically but about the feeling that had come from what he'd done. She kept returning to it the way you return to a word you've heard for the first time and want to learn the shape of. The feeling wasn't gratitude exactly. Or it was gratitude, but it was also something underneath that. It was something about how the defense had been made, not with spectacle, not with the performance of masculine protection that she'd seen occasionally and always found obscurely embarrassing. The kind where a man made a scene of defending a woman in a way that was really about the man making a scene. Striking Bear hadn't performed anything. He had made an assessment. He had made a decision. He had said 2 words. He had gone back to his meal. There was honestly no theater in it, no posturing, no suggestion that his action bought him anything or was meant to. She couldn't think of many men who had ever done anything on her behalf in that spirit, without theater, without purchase. She went to for what it's worth, sleep thinking about it, and woke up Thursday morning with the same thought sitting on the edge of her consciousness like a patient animal. Striking Bear was still in Caldwell on Thursday. She discovered this when she came to work and found him already there, sitting at the same stool at the end of the bar with a cup of coffee that Amos had apparently provided without being asked. He acknowledged her when she came in with a nod that wasn't the performative nod of a man establishing something. The practical nod of a person who has seen someone they recognize. "Morning," Clara said. "Good morning," he said. She went about her opening work, the sweeping, the stool arrangement, the tin basin, and he drank his coffee and didn't make conversation and didn't seem to expect any. This was, she found, comfortable. Most of the men who sat at her bar in the morning wanted something from the silence, they wanted it filled, or they wanted her to acknowledge its weight, or they wanted to use it as a kind of test. Striking Bear simply occupied it the way a person occupies a room they live in. Without apology and without demand. "You're staying in town?" she asked when she came back behind the bar. "Another day, or I think 2, he said. "I've business with the trading post." She nodded. She almost left it there, then she said, "What you did yesterday, I want you to know I appreciated it." He looked at her, same steady assessment as the day before. "He had no cause to touch you," he said. "Men touch the women who work in places like this," she said. It, for what it's worth, came out more flatly than she intended. "It's common." "Common doesn't mean permitted," he said. She didn't have anything to say to that immediately. She turned to check on the coffee pot. The sentence settled in the room like something dropped on a hard floor, distinct and clear. "I think common doesn't mean permitted." She had known this in some part of herself, had known it the way you know a thing that you've filed under not worth fighting for. Hearing it said out loud plainly, as if it were merely a statement of fact rather than a radical claim, did something to the filing system. Later that morning, about 10, when the saloon was still quiet and Gerald was doing his accounts in the back room, 3 men came in. She knew 2 of them. Hale Pettit pretty much was a cattleman who ran a modest operation south of town and came in most Thursdays for a drink and to complain about cattle prices. With him was his brother-in-law, a young man named Worth who had the specific blankness of someone who hadn't yet decided what he thought about anything and was waiting for someone to tell him. The third man Clara didn't recognize. He was lean and weathered with the look of someone who had been places and hadn't enjoyed all of them, and he wore a colt on his left hip in a way that suggested it wasn't new to him. The 3 of them came to the bar. Hale Pettit ordered whiskey, which his brother-in-law ordered the same. The third man ordered nothing and stood with his back to the bar and his eyes on Striking Bear, who was still at his stool at the end. "Heard you had some excitement yesterday," Hale said to Clara. "Nothing I'd call excitement," she said. "Here there was an Indian in here making trouble." "There was a man in here," Clara said, pouring whiskey. "He had food and water and caused no trouble." "Heard he threatened Fowler." "Fowler grabbed my arm," Clara said. She put the glasses on the bar. "The man asked him to stop. Nobody threatened anybody." Hale received this information with the expression of a man who has been handed a narrative he preferred, is being asked to exchange it for one he finds less satisfying. "Still," he said, "don't seem right, them coming into town establishments, not with the way things are." "The way things are," Clara said, "is that he came in and paid and behaved himself." The third man turned from his position against the bar. Actually, he didn't address Clara. He spoke towards Striking Bear, who hadn't moved. "I hear, in my opinion, you've been making yourself comfortable," he said. Striking Bear set down his coffee cup. He turned on the stool and looked at the man. "I've been drinking coffee," he said. "Uh-huh." The man took a step toward the end of the bar. "You understand that some people in this town have got a long memory for what your people have done to settlers up and down this territory." "I've a long memory as well," Striking Bear said. His voice hadn't changed in any way that Clara could identify, but something in the air of the room had shifted, the way air shifts in the moment before a storm that hasn't arrived yet. Best you finish up and get on, the man said. Striking Bear looked at him for a long moment, then he looked at the coffee cup. Then back at the man. When I am finished, Striking Bear said, I'll go, not before. The man's hand went to his belt, not to the gun near it in the way men sometimes do when they want to make a point about available options. Enough, Gerald Cass had appeared from the back room. Clara hadn't heard him come through. He stood kind of behind the bar with the specific look of a man who is irritated about being pulled away from his accounts. This is my place of business. You want TBH to drink, sit down and drink. You want to argue, take it outside. I don't care what you've got against each other in here, everybody behaves or everybody leaves. The third man looked at Gerald. Gerald wasn't, I think, a large man, but he had the quality of someone who has made up his mind about something and will not be altered, and this quality in Clara's experience was often worth more than size. He started it, the man said. He was sitting there drinking coffee, Gerald said. You started a conversation I didn't ask for in my saloon, to be fair now. Sit down or leave. A long beat, the man left, plus Hale Pettit and his brother-in-law stayed and drank their whiskey in a silence that had gone complicated. Clara, refilled their glasses without being asked and didn't look at Striking Bear and didn't look at Gerald, who went back to his accounts. When the Pettit brothers left 20 minutes later, the saloon was empty except for Clara and Striking Bear. Amos, who honestly had watched everything from the kitchen pass through with the concentrated attention of a man watching something he will think about for years. Striking Bear finished his coffee. Plus, does this happen often? He said. TBH, Clara considered the question. Plus, more or less, she said, depending on the day. He nodded. He set some coins on the bar, more than the coffee was worth, she noticed. He stood. I'll be back well tomorrow, he said. To be fair, it wasn't a question. I'll be in my opinion here, she said. He left. She collected the coins and held them in her palm for a moment before she put them in the cash box. Amos appeared at the pass-through. Plus, good man, Amos said. This was a significant statement from Amos, who said almost nothing about people. Yes, Clara said. I, for what it's worth, think so. She wasn't naive enough to think that the third man with the Colt on his left hip was simply going to walk away and find something else to do with his resentments. Men like that didn't let things alone. She had seen, in my opinion, it before, the way an incident like this one, which had in reality consisted of very little, became a story that grew in the retelling until the original incident was barely recognizable. And the story the men carrying it had come to believe was one in which they were the aggrieved party and action wasn't merely justified but required. She was right. Friday morning arrived with a quality of October light that she would remember later with strange precision, pale gold and horizontal, the kind of light that makes everything look like a painting of itself. She walked to the golden spur and found that someone had written something on the door in chalk. 2 words. She stood and looked at them for a moment. Then she went inside and got a wet rag and came back out and wiped them off the door. Gerald came in later and she told him about it. He listened with the expression of a man who is trying to decide how much of a problem this is for him personally. He said he, I guess, would talk to the constable. She didn't say what she thought about the constable, which was that the constable, a man named Webb, was the kind of official whose relationship with problems was primarily to wait and see if they resolved themselves, and intervene only once the resolution had already happened, usually to take credit for it. Striking, I think. Bear came in at noon. He sat at his stool. Clara brought him food and water without being asked because she had learned his order by now and because there was something about the act of bringing a person the thing they needed without needing to be asked that felt in the current climate of the week like a small deliberate statement. He noticed. She could tell he noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He ate. 2 cowboys came in at noon who looked at him and looked at each other and sat at the far table and conducted themselves without incident. A woman came in looking for her husband and found him, and there was a scene, and amid the scene no one paid any attention to anything else, which was perhaps the most useful thing the scene accomplished. Look, the afternoon settled, and then around 3 o'clock Fowler came back. He didn't come alone. He had brought 2 men with him who had the specific quality of men who have been recruited for a purpose. They were present not because they wanted whiskey or food, but because they had been asked to be present. Fowler had rearranged the story in his mind over the preceding 2 days into something that had put him in the right, and he had found men who were willing to accept the arrangement. He came straight to the bar, which he looked past Clara at Striking Bear, who had turned on his stool and was watching with the same steady quality he brought to everything. You've outstayed your welcome, Fowler said. I wasn't aware I'd a welcome to outstay, Striking Bear said. This town doesn't want you here. These people, Fowler gestured vaguely at the room which contained, at that moment, exactly 3 other people, none of whom had indicated any opinion about anything. These people have got their reasons. I am here for trade, Striking Bear said. I trade, I eat. Basically, I leave no trouble. What I am outstaying isn't a welcome but your preference, which is a different thing. One of the recruited men moved, not toward Striking Bear, toward Clara. He put his hand flat on the bar next to hers, not touching, just present, looked at her with the expression of a man who wanted her to understand something about his proximity. "You," he said, "you've been real friendly this week, serving his kind, talking like he's a regular customer." Clara looked at the hand next to hers. She looked, at the man. "Plus, he is a regular customer," she said, "3 days in a row." "You're an embarrassment," the man said. "You know what people are saying about you." Clara had spent 2 years building a stillness for moments like this. She reached for it now and found it and stood inside it. "I know what people say about me," she said. "I've known for 2 years and it's never stopped me from doing my job." The man leaned forward. "Your job," he said, "is to serve who we tell you to serve and not." "Her job," said Striking Bear, "is the same today as it was on Wednesday." He stood up. The 3 men looked at him, which, and here, right here, was the moment that Clara would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to people who hadn't been in the room. Because what happened next wasn't a fight, it wasn't a display of force. It wasn't a threat. Striking Bear reached, into the pouch at his belt. He set something on the bar beside Clara's hand. A small carved piece of bone, worn smooth, shaped like nothing she could immediately identify, just a shape, a small object, the kind of thing a person carries for reasons that are theirs alone. He looked at Fowler. "I was taught," he said, "that a person reveals their character not in how they treat those who can harm them, but in how they treat those who cannot." The room was very quiet. "I'll be in this town one more day," he said, "and I'll come into this establishment and eat and drink and leave money on the bar, and no one honestly will put their hand on this woman while I am present. This isn't a threat," he paused. "It is a statement of what will happen." He sat back down. He picked up his cup, which Fowler stood there for a moment that lasted much longer than its actual duration. His 2 well-recruited men weren't looking at him in the way that recruited men are supposed to look at the person who recruited them. They were looking at Striking Bear with the expression of people who have been handed a piece of information they weren't expecting and are still processing. Fowler left, plus his men TBH went with him. Clara looked at the piece of carved bone on the bar. She looked at Striking Bear. He was drinking his coffee. "What is this?" she asked. He glanced at it. "A reminder," he said, "and for difficult days." He paused. "You can keep it if you want, I've others." She picked it up. It was warm from being in the pouch. Smooth, she couldn't tell, to be fair, what animal the bone came from. She closed her hand around it. "Thank you," she said, "for the second time in 3 days, I think." He nodded. "The pork was better today," he said. "Tell your cook." She looked at him. He was completely serious, and she went to the kitchen pass-through and told Amos his pork was better today, and Amos said, "I know." And Clara stood at the pass-through with her back to the room for a moment, and the small carved bone was in her apron pocket, and outside the October light was still doing what it always did, moving slowly across the floor in long gold rectangles, marking the passage of ordinary time. But the time, she knew, wasn't going to stay ordinary. Fowler had left the saloon, but Fowler hadn't left the story. He was out there in the town right now, rearranging things again, recruiting again, building a version of events that ended differently than this afternoon had. She knew this, she wasn't wrong. What happened the following morning would be the thing that forced every person in Caldwell to decide, finally and without ambiguity, what kind of town they were. And what Striking Bear did would be the thing they talked about for the rest of their lives. Clara knew it well before she reached the end of her street. There was a quality to the morning light that was fine and ordinary: clear sky, cold air, the town just waking up, horses at the rail outside the feed store, but underneath it there was something else, the way sometimes the day before a storm is the calmest and clearest day of the week. She had grown up in weather that taught this lesson repeatedly. Clear sky, cold air, trouble coming. She walked to the Golden Spur and didn't find writing on the door this time. Instead she found Mavis standing outside it, not going in, which was unusual because Mavis never stood outside anything when she could be inside it. Mavis was standing with her arms crossed, and her face in an expression Clara had learned to read. It was Mavis's expression for situations that had moved past inconvenient into something she didn't have a comfortable word for. "What?" Clara said, plus Mavis looked at her. "Webb came by last night, the constable." "I know who Webb is. He told Gerald that some men in town are saying the Comanche man needs to leave, that they're not going to wait for him to finish his trading." Clara stopped walking. "How many men?" "Fowler, and others, and Webb wouldn't say who, but his face said more than he wanted it to." "What did Gerald say?" "Gerald said it wasn't his problem." Mavis's voice carried the particular flatness of a person who isn't surprised by something but is disappointed by it anyway. "He said the man would likely leave today on his own and the whole thing would sort itself out." Clara looked at the saloon door, then she looked at Mavis. "Does Striking Bear know?" "I don't know what he knows," Mavis said. "But he wasn't at the rooming house when I passed it this morning. He was at the trading post. I saw him through the window." Clara turned and walked toward the trading post. Mavis called after her, "Clara." Clara turned. Mavis was looking at her with an expression that had several things in it. "You be careful," Mavis said, "which what you're doing standing up for him, talking back to Fowler. People in this town don't forget that." "I know," Clara said. "Then why?" "Because somebody has to," Clara said. It came out plain and without drama, the way the truest things often do. She turned and walked. The trading post was a long, low building on the north end of the main street, owned by a man named Thatcher who ran it with the even temperament of someone whose business depended on transactions being completed without incident. Thatcher served whoever walked through his door, because Thatcher understood that the door was the filter, not the man behind the counter. This wasn't a moral position exactly, it was a commercial one, but in a border town in 1873 it was rarer than it should have been. Striking Bear was at the counter when Clara came in. He was negotiating for something, she could see pelts and worked leather goods on the counter surface, and Thatcher was writing figures in a ledger. Striking Bear looked up when she entered. He read her face before she said anything. She could tell by the slight shift in his posture, not alarm but alertness, the kind that comes from having lived a life in which reading a face quickly was a practical skill. "There's been talk," she said without preamble. "Fowler and some others, they're saying they want you to leave before you're ready to leave." A pause. "How many?" "I don't know exactly, more than 2 or 3. Striking Bear looked back at Thatcher. "Can we finish this tomorrow?" Thatcher looked up from his ledger. He had heard what Clara said. "We can finish it now," he said. "Give me 10 TBH minutes." He worked faster. Plus, Striking Bear turned back to Clara. He wasn't, she noticed, afraid, which she had expected. Fear, or at least the version of preparation for conflict that in most men resembled fear. What she saw instead was something more like calculation, steady and practical, the way an experienced person assesses a problem to determine what the actual variables are. "Are you safe?" he said. I think the question stopped her. It wasn't the question she had come to be asked, she had come to warn him. The conversation in her mind had been structured as her providing information and him receiving it. The question reversed the structure entirely, which "I don't know," she said honestly. "Fowler blames you," Striking Bear said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." He nodded. He looked TBH at the door. "Then you shouldn't be in the open by yourself." "I'm not by myself. Mavis is at the saloon." "Mavis is one person." He paused. There a lawman here who functions?" Clara considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "What does the minimum required?" she said. "If there's clear trouble in the street, he'll show up. Getting, I think, ahead of trouble isn't something he practices." "Most lawmen are the same," Striking Bear said, not with bitterness, with the simple observation of someone who had encountered a great many systems of authority and had reached conclusions about them. Thatcher passed the coins and the ledger across the counter. Striking Bear collected them and put them in his pouch. He looked at Clara. "Walk with me," he said. They went out into the Saturday morning. Plus, the town was awake now, Saturday being the day when people came in from the surrounding land to conduct their weekly business. The street had the particular organized chaos of a market morning. Families, horses, a wagon unloading at the dry goods store, a group of cowboys who had ridden in last night and were operating on insufficient sleep. Clara kind of walked beside Striking Bear and was aware of the looks, aware of them not because they were invisible but because she had been collecting looks for 2 years and had developed a taxonomy. There were the looks that were simply curious. There were the looks that were calculating, measuring what they saw against some internal ledger. There were the looks that contained something hotter and less neutral. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why, look, are you still here? And you could have left Thursday after the first incident with Fowler." He was quiet for a moment. They passed the feed store. A man tying his horse to the rail watched them go by. "My business wasn't finished," he said. "It's finished now." "Yes," he paused, but I am asking myself whether leaving because of what these men have done is the same as agreeing that they had the right to do it." She hadn't expected this. She turned to look at him. "There's a difference," he said, "between choosing to leave and being driven away. The first is a decision, the second is a defeat." "It could also be alive," she said, "versus not." Corner of his mouth moved. It kind of wasn't quite a smile, more the acknowledgement of a point well made. "That is also true," he said. They had reached the end of the main street without incident. The saloon was visible ahead. Clara could see Mavis at the door now, still with her arms crossed, watching them approach. Behind them, the market street continued its Saturday business. Nothing had happened, nothing was happening, and actually then it was 3 men came around the corner of the livery stable. Not running, that was the thing Clara noticed, that they came around the corner at a walk, the deliberate walk of people who had decided on something. Weren't in a hurry because they had already made the decision and theft was over and now there was only the execution of it. Fowler was one of them. The man with the colt on his left hip was another. The third was someone Clara had never seen before, broad and not young, with a face that had the settled quality of permanent anger. Fowler stopped about, honestly, 15 feet from them. He looked at Clara and then at Striking Bear and then at Clara again, and the look he gave her was the specific look of a man who has decided that she's the reason for his problem and that this is information she should have. "This has gone on long enough," Fowler said. Clara was aware of the market street behind them. People hadn't enticed. The Saturday business was continuing, but it had acquired a secondary quality, the quality of people continuing to do what they were doing while also watching something else. She could feel the watching. It was a particular kind of attention, collective and suspended. Striking Bear said nothing. Honestly, he stood. You've been in this town 4 days, Fowler said. You've been in that saloon every day which you've been stirring up trouble. I've drunk coffee, Striking Bear said, and eaten salt pork and paid for both. You've been. I've sat at a bar and been quiet. I've asked a man once to stop touching a woman who had done nothing to him. This is the trouble I've stirred. He paused. Tell me which part of this you find unacceptable. Fowler's face was doing the thing it had done in the saloon, the sequence of expressions that were really the same expression in different configurations, all of them arranged around the central feeling of a man who has been contradicted. You don't belong here, Fowler said. I belong wherever I stand, Striking Bear said. This is ground I've more claim to than you can count. The man with the Colt took a step forward. His hand was at his hip, not on the gun at it. The distinction was important and everyone present understood it. Clara stepped forward. She did this without thinking about it, which was the only way she ever did the things that mattered. She stepped between Striking Bear and the 3 men, and she stood there in the Saturday morning light on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in her plain dress and her work-rough hands, and she looked at Fowler. This stops here, she said. Fowler stared at her. Get out of the way, Clara. No, this doesn't concern you. You grabbed my arm in that saloon because you didn't like that I served a customer, she said. Her voice was steady. She was aware of it being steady in a way. That wasn't her usual steadiness, not the practiced stillness of a woman who has learned to survive by going quiet. Sort of, this was something different. Something that had come up through her the way water comes up through ground in spring, not forced, just present. You embarrassed yourself in front of a room full of people. Then you spent 3 days finding men to come back here and try to make what you did into something else. And now you're standing in the street on a Saturday morning with your friends. Your guns and you're telling me this doesn't concern me. She took a breath. My name is Clara Holt. I've worked in that saloon for 2 years. I've been grabbed and insulted and talked over and paid less than what I earned, and I've done every single thing that was asked of me because I needed the work and the town didn't offer women like me much else. And I am standing here right now because 3 days ago a man I didn't know defended me when he had no reason to and no obligation to and didn't ask for anything in return. And the least pretty much I can do, the very least, is stand in front of him right now and tell you that if you want to get to him you're going to have to go through me first and let everyone on this street watch you do it. The Saturday morning was very still. Behind her she heard Striking Bear exhale. It was a quiet sound. She didn't know what it meant. Mavis had come off the saloon step and was walking toward them. Amos was at the saloon door. The cowboy who had been tying his horse at the feed store rail was still there, not leaving, watching. A woman with 2 children had stopped walking and was watching from the other side of the street. The man at the dry goods store was in his doorway. Fowler was looking at Clara as if he had never looked at her before, which was perhaps true in the way that mattered. He had looked at her for 2 years as a piece of the furniture of the Golden Spur, a pair of hands, a body and an apron. He hadn't looked at her. He was looking at her now, which the man with the Colt had gone still. The hand at his hip hadn't moved, but something in his posture had changed. The certainty that had been in his walk when he came around the corner of the livery stable was no longer entirely present. He, was doing the calculation that men do when a situation has changed shape in a way they didn't plan for. The broad man with the face of permanent anger said very quietly to Fowler, "Bryce, this ain't what I thought it was." Fowler said nothing. "I got a wife on this street," the man said. "I got kids in this town and I ain't." He stopped. He looked at the man with the Colt. "I'm going home," he said. He walked away, in my opinion not fast, the walk of a man who has made a decision he will stand by. The man with the Colt looked at Fowler. Something passed honestly between them that Clara couldn't fully read, but the outcome of it was that the hand moved away from the hip, straightened. "Come on, Bryce," he said. Fowler was still looking at Clara. "You've made enemies today," he said. His voice pretty much had lost most of what it had started with. "I'd enemies on Wednesday," Clara said, "plus the specific ones I didn't change this morning." Fowler walked away. His hired man walked with him. The street watched them go and Clara stood where she was. The market morning gradually resumed its volume, not all at once. Incrementally, voices picking up one by one, the ordinary business of Saturday reasserting itself over what had just occupied its space. Behind her, Striking Bear said, "Clara." She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. The assessment was still there, it was always there, but there was something in it she couldn't immediately name. It honestly wasn't gratitude exactly, though there was gratitude in it. It was something closer to recognition. Plus, the same thing she had felt on Wednesday when he had asked Fowler to sit down. The recognition of one person by another person. Clear, honestly, and simple, and worth more than almost anything. "You didn't have to do that," he said. You didn't have, I guess, to do what you did on Wednesday, she said. He was honestly quiet for a moment, then he said, no, I didn't have to. They looked at each other. Mavis arrived beside Clara and took her arm, not the way Fowler had taken it, nothing like that, the way a person takes the arm of someone they're standing beside. Come inside, Mavis said quietly, both of you. They went in. Amos already had coffee on. He set out 3 cups and then a fourth for himself without asking anyone's permission, and sat down at the bar with the rest of them, which he had never done before. They drank coffee on a Saturday morning in October while the town outside went back to being a town, and no one said very much, because what had happened wasn't a thing that needed much said about it. It needed to sit, the way things sit when they're real and complete and don't require annotation. After a while, Striking Bear set his cup down. I'll finish my business tomorrow, he said, and I'll leave Monday. You don't have to leave on our account, Clara said. For what it's worth, I'm not, he said. I was always leaving Monday, I've people waiting. He looked at her. My people have a practice, he said. When someone does something that costs them something, puts something at risk on behalf of another person, we don't say thank you. The word isn't large enough. We actually say, and here he said a word in his own language, a word that Clara didn't know and couldn't pronounce, but that had a sound to it like something being placed carefully on a level surface, settled and cert. What does it mean? She asked. Plus, roughly, he said, it means I see what you did, I see what it cost, and I'll carry it. Clara held the coffee cup in both hands. The morning light through the saloon windows was doing its thing, moving slowly across the floor in long gold rectangles. I don't need to be carried, she said. No, he said, but the act deserves to be remembered by someone. That actually is all it means. Someone will, I think, remember it. She thought about that for a while. The idea that a thing you do, a small, ordinary, brave thing on a Saturday morning, might be held in someone's memory and carried forward into the world. Not turned into legend. Not exaggerated into something it wasn't. Just held, well kept, plus like passed on to people you'd never meet who would know without knowing you that you had once stood in the street and refused to move. Okay, she said, then I'll carry Wednesday. He looked at her. You stepped like between me and what was happening to me, she said. I'll tbh carry that, that's fair. Something in his expression settled, like a thing finding its level. Yes, he said, which that is fair. Outside, Caldwell went about it Saturday. The cattle would move through the territory again in spring, and the land agents would come and go, and the constable would continue to arrive after the fact and take credit for resolutions he hadn't taching to do with, and Gerald Cass would keep his complicated feelings in his pocket where he had always kept them. Fowler would stay in Caldwell for another 3 years before moving east, and he wouldn't come into the Golden Spur on Clara's shifts for the remainder of his time there. Striking Bear left on Monday as he had said he would. He left early, before the saloon opened. He left money with Thatcher for a credit in Clara's name, which she discovered 3 weeks later when she went in for thread, and Thatcher mentioned it with the studied neutrality of a man reporting a ledger entry. She stood in the trading post for a moment after he said it. Then she thanked him and bought the thread and walked back in the October light. She still had the piece of carved bone in her apron pocket. She had moved it from apron to apron every day since he'd set it on the bar. She didn't know what it was supposed to remind you of. He had said simply that it was for difficult days, and she had found that this was information sufficient to the purpose. On the difficult days, she put her hand in her pocket and felt its warmth from being against her body and its smoothness from whatever hands had worn it smooth before hers. And she thought about a man who had come into a saloon in October and ordered water and salt pork and paid what was owed and asked a man to sit down when a woman had been hurt, and then gone back to his meal as if all of this were simply what a person did. She thought, that's all it is really. That is the whole instruction. When someone is hurt in front of you, say something. Not for glory, not because, well, it will be remembered. Not because like it is safe or easy or convenient. Say something because it is the thing that should be done and you're the one who is there to do it. I think she carried that. She carried it for the rest of her life, which was longer and more interesting than anyone in Caldwell in 1873 would have predicted for a saloon maid nobody watched. And somewhere on the southern plains, moving through the tall grass of a territory that had once been entirely his, was now contested and reduced and fenced and fought over, a Comanche warrior named Striking Bear was carrying something too. I think 2 people, 2 ordinary mornings. One town that watched and then turned back to its business. It wasn't history in the large sense. No book recorded it, plus no statue was built. But it moved from mouth to mouth across the territory the way true things do, quietly, one person at a time, and in each retelling something essential survived. A girl was hurt for doing her job. A man she didn't know said, "That'sn't permitted." She said, "I for what it's worth see what you did," and he said, "I see what you did," and they both went on. Plus, which is perhaps the best any of us can do in the time we've in the particular patch of ground where we happen to be standing with whatever words we've available. Say something, go back to your work, kind of carry the thing forward. Honestly, that is enough. That it turns sort of out is everything.